Welcome to Electric Grumpy World. I am your host, Electric Sheep City, and joined by my eternal co-host, Guy Grumpy. Eternally my co-host, Guy Grumpy. Guy Grumpy, how are you fare this evening, buddy?
I'm faring quite well. Thank you
I'm
for asking. How
so
about
glad
yourself?
to hear it. I'm doing rather well myself as well. Thank you very much for asking, friend. Oh boy, was there an episode of Westworld this past Sunday.
Indeed.
It was an amazing genre-bending episode that I've been particularly fond of. Not gonna lie, it was a lot of fun. So of course, spoilers for the entire season 3 of Westworld that is out. Obviously, nothing like that isn't out yet, because if you think that we have access to that, you are wrong.
There may be spoilers. There may just be guesses for future episodes.
We definitely have plenty of those. So, of course, like I said, we are talking about season 3, episode 5 of Westworld. Genre. There is a lot to kind of unpack in this episode. So, about to kind of dive into the basic plots without kind of further ado, because there's a lot of kind of info dump to get through before we can get to the fun part. So there were about 5 basic plots that I spotted in this episode. Those being, of course, Serac's history, Caleb's genre trip through multiple different genres, freeing the Incite information. And I think that Incite in the closed captioning for this was actually spelled Incite instead of Sight, which it was spelled the other way previously. Yeah. So I found that just kind of, I don't know if that was intentional or not on the show creators' parts, but I couldn't help but notice it since I always watch with closed captions. Caleb's identity crisis and Dolores and Serac's standoff.
Now, some of these do go together very well, and there's a lot of crossover between them as far as what they mean, but they're definitely different story arcs that happen in this one, and it's just a different way of telling the story than they have in any other episode in any of the seasons.
Yeah, I've got to say, we were talking about this a little bit in chat beforehand, before we kind of dove into voice chat. And to me, this seemed, aside from the interludes going into Serac's history, this seemed to be one of the most linear episodes that we've gotten as far as, timeline jumping. Like, the things that were Serac's history were pretty blatantly like a different timeline. I found that really interesting.
So they were a different timeline, but they were the accesses of the files by Dolores. So it's still happening in this timeline, but she was learning and we're learning along with her. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, so that was a really kind of cool way that they wove those together, I thought. So I mentioned Serac's history. This is both kind of like an info dump as well as kind of a revelation about how he both seized power, and boy howdy did he, and how he's kind of wielded that power and how that power has kind of corrupted Serac. So throughout the entire thing, he's telling the story to Rehoboam. And of course, then, like you said, the lens that we're seeing this in is Dolores kind of reading or hearing or kind of downloading the upload from Rehoboam with that information.
Right. And it's interesting that it starts back with something that we had seen before, the destruction of Paris, and um, moves along to how they survived and how that affected him and his brother who kept him alive, um, to force them, or not force them, but to inspire them to create uh, this device. I did find it interesting though that it never that in this process, I don't know if it was meant to show the ego of Serac, that they never brought up Delos and the purchase of that information as part of this. So I mean, I know that we know that through other means, so maybe they didn't feel the need to show that, but I would
Mhm.
find that interaction very intriguing as well. How they got that information from William and why William might have bowed to it.
Well, and it seemed like to me that it was that the purchase of the Delos information happened a little bit after kind of these ones, because Incite and Peter Dempsey's were the only thing that he seemed to bring was kind of the information, the data that happened before the privacy laws or whatnot. Um, so it seemed like, and this is just kind of reading between the lines, that this was before the purchase of the Delos information, but that could be incorrect as well, um,
Mm.
because they at this point, Serac and his brother don't have the money. Like that's the only reason why they're kind of bowing down to Peter Dimsey. That and the data with which they're kind of uh, building Rehoboam on top of. Um, those are kind of the things that they end up kind of leveraging, and the only reason why he's necessary because he's not actually doing anything. Like he's not really bringing any intellectual capital to the table, aside from the raw data. Um, but other than that,
Did
he's just kind of obfuscating them rather than actually helping them.
right? Did maybe I missed it? Did they explain how he got that data, or just kind of hand waved that this data was available and he had it because there weren't the privacy laws?
Yeah, they just said that he had the data from before the privacy laws, so they didn't really kind of go into what Insight was before then, or kind of how it accumulated that data, kind of anything like that. So it was kind of hand waved, but so that wasn't expounded upon, which is honestly kind of one of the few things this episode that wasn't. I feel like I learned a lot more than I expected to about the foundation of Insight. Well, current Insight, and the
Right.
the creation of Rehoboam than I thought that I would. Granted, they don't tell us kind of how they developed the different ideas behind the algorithm, or kind of how they got there. Nor did I kind of expect them to. But as
Wh-
far as the like companies establishment and the way that it becomes entrenched in society, I didn't expect to see a whole lot of that, and I saw a lot more of that this episode than I thought that I would this entire season.
Which, from a timeline perspective, is why I was confused at where the purchase of the mind map from Delos would have
Mm-hmm.
taken place, because they seem to make this jump to extremely accurate predictions pretty quickly and turning the stock market on its side to make them a lot of money. So at some point shortly after that, then it would seem they would need that extra bit for predicting the human element. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what we saw was instead they could pretty accurately predict or affect the decisions of people with that information.
Absolutely. And I feel like we probably could and should have gotten a little bit of that whenever they were talking about the development of the kind of programming, because they were trying to
Mhm.
program the humans. He was using his brother as that test subject, whatnot. Whenever they talked about that part, um, and I feel like that is the kind of natural point that the uh, Delos information, the Delos mind mapping, would have been kind of connected, but we don't get it.
Agree.
They
Agreed.
don't make that connection.
Or
Nope.
at least not yet.
Right. And the I feel like that's probably where they kind of would have applied that, and where they would have they both had enough power at that point to and money in order to buy that information. Um, and then, of course, they also would have the reason to buy that information, despite Rehoboam and their algorithm already having such a foothold. These outliers, these anomalies, are kind of getting in the way, and the mind
The
map is
flies
kind
in
of
the ointment.
the flies in the ointment. Exactly.
So that's kind of leading me to believe that there is a secret there, and that they will fill in that hole, and that it has something to do with the Williams storyline.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only reason I bring that up.
The Williams storyline and or the brother storyline. I think that, we don't see what happens to the brother. I think that those two might be pretty well linked, but we'll see.
I've got a theory on that that we'll get to a little bit later.
Fair enough. So, like you said, Dimsey threatened to divest, so they do some stock market predictions and make him a ton of money, and he's like, oh, never mind, I should never have doubted you. So Serac and his brother charted a course for the human race, and Dempsey got greedy. So they kind of locked him out of the system. They don't really go into what all locking him out of the system really means, but he's locked out. They do say that much.
And that's really interesting, and maybe an inconsistency, because as we fast forward to his story, it seems like he still did have some access to the system.
Mm-hmm.
Just a matter of what he was locked out of, and what they still let him know and access would be those changes. And I don't know if that plays into the end then, or not, but I think we'll get there in another slide. So.
Well, and not only that, but I think that him being locked out is probably one of the reasons why he was so curious, because he didn't know what they were getting up to. And if he had they hadn't locked him out of everything, then he may have been able to just kind of like, oh, well, I know what's going on, I don't need to worry about it so much. So it may have been them shooting themselves in the foot a little bit, to be completely honest, though that could just be my speculation.
Yeah, because he did still have some level of access. I don't want to leave too much there, because I think we do circle back to it at the end. But he does mention later on that he already checked the simulation, so he knows what to expect before he goes to any of these meetings, and at least has an idea of what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I think I know exactly where you're headed with that. And so I'm going to catch up to you, because that's one of the parts that I'm the most excited to talk about, not going to lie.
Okay.
So the projection, the algorithm started showing the world becoming unglued, including Serac's brother. Dimsey got curious about what Serac and his brother are up to after 10 years of just cashing the checks and collecting the money without, again, like I said, bringing any of the intellectual labor into it. He's not really contributing it much, but he sure is getting a payout, and he's getting societal credit for their work as well. So he gets curious. He goes and he checks out what they're up to, finds out that Serac has been attempting to edit people. He's been experimenting on his brother, because his brother is one of those kind of outliers that he kind of finds that is showing the world becoming unglued because of those outliers. So Serac is trying to eliminate those anomalies by reprogramming. He's saying in that exchange, he's like, well, we could kill them. Isn't reprogramming them more humane? And it's like, I mean, on the one hand, I guess it's more humane than killing them, but also, is it?
That's a great question, and that's kind of what all of Westworld is about, right? Like, if at what point does humanity begin, and when does that become a problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, and whenever we get to Caleb's story a little bit later, he pretty much comes to the conclusion that trying to reprogram people instead of just killing them is less humane, significantly less humane, with his kind of rat analogy. And so Caleb, kind of as our stand-in, is basically saying, no, that's not humane to give people hope and to kind of try and reprogram them instead. But as a viewer, I'm not sure, I don't think either one is a good solution, right? Killing people, obviously not good. Reprogramming them, I don't think is good either. So
Right.
I don't know that either one's a good solution.
And I know we're scheduled to talk about the rat story a little bit later, but I don't feel like that had the same connotation that he was hoping that it would, because either way, the rats in the bucket are going to die. It's just a matter of one, and they try to survive as long as they can, and the other, they just succumb to their fate. So I'm not sure that that's any better.
That's a really good point. Those rats die either way.
Yeah.
So then Dempsey tells Serac that he cannot allow this reprogramming to go on. He's like, I've got morals somehow. I just grew them randomly, and all of a sudden this is just not okay.
So I took that as kind of a self-preservation, and that they're coming to the point that, hey, I'm getting all these accolades, and I'm the one that is the face of this company, and I can do all this stuff. And then when he learns that they're actually reprogramming people to do their bidding, then he gets a little tinge of, wait a second, if they can do that, if he would do it to his own brother, why wouldn't he do it to me? And then I don't have the power anymore. So I kind of took it down that line, that he's a rich, powerful person and he wants to maintain it. And so he's like, no, you cannot do this anymore. This program's shut down and I'm still in control. But he's really not.
And that conclusion, that like how he kind of grew those morals being just self-preservation, makes so much more sense than I'm upstanding citizen now suddenly.
Right. Although he might have bought into his own hype. Sometimes when people get into power, then they seem to think that everything they do is perfect, right? And maybe has that twinge of morality then show up from time to time.
I could buy that as well. So Serac, whenever confronted by Dempsey, tells him that every simulation where Dempsey told the public about Serac's trials, every single simulation that happened ended in human extinction, which is why Serac's brother wanted to kill Dempsey. And, Dempsey's basically like, hey, this is what you're talking about whenever Dempsey says, I've seen the simulations. I know that you don't kill me here. And then Serac kills Dempsey like later on in that conversation.
After explaining that there are these little white spaces where you're truly free to have a decision, and that's a turning point, and there it leads you to believe that those decision points are the points where the anomalies, the anomalous behavior can occur. And to me, I'm not sure if that is a branching point where you can go multiple different ways, which is kind of where I thought they were going with the genre drug later, or if it's something that they hid from Dempsey because they knew that this was the inevitable outcome, and so he wanted to eliminate him, and obviously he was going to check to see if he gets killed before he goes on this dangerous mission to wherever they were, and then it's a surprise, no, this actually happened. And the other interesting thing about this is there were several times, or a couple of times anyway, that Serac had talked to Dempsey about about his brother wanting to kill him, but then he was kind of like, I'm the good guy, I'm going to let you go. So when he turns and kills him, it kind of had me questioning who was altered.
That's a really good point. I didn't even think about that. Well, speaking of altering, one of the kind of themes that I took from this episode, and really, I think my theme for Serac's history is kind of one of the things about Rehoboam, and that is kind of allegorical to season one in particular of Westworld. So like you were saying, there are these white spaces where the kind of anomalous behavior pops up. Well, whereas the um, in Rehoboam is basically just plotting, hey, here are what all of the here's the trajectory that all of this kind of goes in. Um, and that's just kind of plotting what the behavior was. Yes, they kind of exert some influence, but by and large, it's just Rehoboam uh, tracking it. Whereas in season one of Westworld, in particular, it's not Rehoboam or them tracking it. It's the people who are in charge determining those loops are. To make an allegory that Bernard makes later in the episode. So it's the people in charge who are Delos who are plotting those, whereas Ford creates a white space for Dolores to decide whether she wants to kill Ford to kind of seize that agency, and so he's creating that for her, and whereas that one is kind of scripted in season one of Westworld, Maeve like finds her own kind of white space whenever she's supposed to go out into the like wide world and you know make her way there. She makes her own decision to turn around and go to visit like her kid. So there's the scripted white spaces, and then there's the more organic white space from season one, which now is also applicable to kind of how Rehoboam is kind of plotting it, be it with exerting the power or just observing it.
That's very interesting, and I'm still not sold that there really is decisions being made by the hosts. I think that's still kind of programming, but it's decision trees where there's a couple different outcomes now instead of just the one. So I do like that calling back to earlier seasons, and I hadn't made that connection, so I'm really happy to hear that you did.
Well, and GJC in chat says, finally, we understand what the right round thing we've been looking at this entire season is. And I personally took later in the episode when Serac is kind of looking at his little like watch one, the white space and whatnot is kind of a more perfect circle. Oh. But at one point, whenever he kind of like flies off the handle and is like, no, this is like anomalous, like this is bad, is whenever one of the corners of the circle is kind of like spewing forth, like it's kind of more obfuscated and like a little bit like blurry essentially. And so it's kind of like the insight, the data or whatever is normally that kind of predicted future, whereas the whenever some of the things are kind of throwing anomalies, it's kind of a little bit messed up. So it's clear, it's definitely how it predicts the future, but how that's visualized, that's how I read it as being visualized, and I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I agree.
So we kind of cap off the Serac's history. This happens a little bit earlier in the episode than the other stuff, but it's the kind of conclusion of the his historical arc. And that is whenever Serac meets with the president of Brazil. He's kind of flexing his power. Basically, the point that I wanted to make with that one is that while Serac at the very least pretends to have started off as being more altruistic, he ends by, now that he's wielding this power, he's corrupted by it. For one, he's able to just kind of exert it and basically say, you don't matter. Like, I can get that guy with a mustache. He'll be the next president. Like, no big deal. So one part is that. And then the other one, I mentioned season 1 of Westworld just a little bit ago, we see the flies kind of surrounding the president of Brazil, and he's having to kind of like shoo it away, and it's kind of that fly in the ointment callback to season 1. That whether the president of Brazil is being anomalous or kind of what that is, that kind of bug or fly in the ointment. I thought was a really good callback and kind of forecast.
Although in season 1, then it was the fly walking across the eyeball and walking across the face and not bothering the people. And obviously the Brazilian president was bothered by it and swatting at it and then eventually kills it. So
True.
I don't think that it really tells us that he's in the simulation or he's a host or anything, but it is an interesting callback. I don't think he was being updated, unless you consider the update from Serac that this uprising is going to happen unless you make changes that we're requesting.
That makes sense. Well, and
like even then, he was trying to be altruistic about it and saying these deals that you're doing illegally and under the table for your friends need to stop, or it's going to happen. So he still felt like he was Thanos, I guess, and needs to destroy the world unless it is perfect. But yeah.
That brings us away from Serac's history. Serac's history was really, really interesting, but the real meat of this story happens in the following kind of plot lines. The next one we kind of go to is Caleb's genre trip. And of course, there are kind of other aspects to this kind of peppered throughout, because this is a much more linear story than we have been getting. But Caleb being infected with and going on his genre trip has been the probably primary focus of this part of the trip. So Dolores and Caleb are escorting Liam. They kidnapped him at the end of the last episode. And Liam doses Caleb with genre. Genre is that kind of like party drug that they talk about in the last episode. So they planted it on him in the episode 4, and he uses it to try and escape from Caleb in season 5. And Caleb's drug trip begins. Episode 5, yes.
And interestingly, and I think importantly for the Caleb's identity storyline, when he does this, when he doses him, it's because he has put on his glasses and got a read for Caleb and is frightened by him. He's like, oh, you don't know who you are. And there's obviously something that he sees from his either past or his future that frightens him a lot more than just what Dolores had shown him or had shown Caleb earlier. So there's something there that makes him want to escape instead of just kind of being the basic person that he is. And he even wears a shirt that says basic to highlight how basic he is. So it's important to know that this then starts him down that path, and that the genre is going to lead him to some self-discovery or self-realizations as well. Also, part of that is when Liam tried to read Dolores, he saw nothing. She wasn't in the system. So he starts to piece some of that together at that point, that things aren't all as they seem.
Absolutely. So Caleb is infected with genre. And genre, essentially what it seems to do is make the user, I guess, wittingly or unwittingly, experience different genres, basically like movies. So this one, for example, starts off with the noir genre. So it keeps on cutting to Caleb in black and white with the kind of 30s style orchestral like background. It was pretty cool. I personally really liked the way that they experimented with the different genres in here. Though I know that may not be shared by my co-host.
Yeah, I felt like it was a little bit more of eyewash and it wasn't fully realized. Like I kind of expected the noir then would lead down a storyline where it was more noir, but and maybe it did in um, the initial screenings or the initial script, and they had to cut it
Mhm.
down for time, and they decided that they only needed 8 episodes, and they wanted to make it as concise as possible. But during the whole noir timeline, really all that happened was they kept looking back to check on him and he looks loopy. That's pretty much it.
So, what I took the kind of thematic element of noir, how it kind of translated into the kind of plot was Caleb was paranoid. He was kept on looking over his shoulder, and people were legitimately following them. You know, he wasn't paranoid without reason. Um, but it was kind of that kind of we're being tailed, kind of try and evade them, that kind of theme that actually kind of seemed to fit with the noir genre. It may be a bit of a
Okay,
stretch, but that's the kind of thematic element that I saw that kind of connected it.
that's fair. But again, I think that didn't really add anything to the story. It just was a cool filter and music choice, similar to as they advance through. I don't know. We might find that it actually is more meaningful what they've chosen for the different genres that he experienced later. But uh, it it made it for interesting storytelling, but I worry that it was detracting from the actual story.
That makes sense. So Caleb is in the noir genre, and Serac's men catch up to them. Dolores basically strong arms Liam into granting them access to the system for them to essentially not just be sitting ducks in their car, because it's like a rideshare type thing. It's one of those autonomous vehicles like we've seen earlier on this season. It's a thing, and they were stopped because of Serac's access to the system, and they end up needing Liam's access to kind of override that. She takes it off of the network so that it's not his override isn't being then overridden. So they're sure to take him off of the network before doing so. But they're able to get access to their own car to have a car chase. And Caleb's genres switches once more into an action genre, and he gets handed this like bazooka type thing that he's standing with his like whole torso out like up outside of the sunroof, the bazooka there, and he like fires it off and he missed. But then Dolores does some technical wizardry to kind of reroute it, and it comes back and hits him. It's a pretty cool action movie type thing. And I think that's definitely one of the ones where it's like full storytelling didn't really add to the plot much at all, because it's just this is action.
But again, yeah, it didn't add much to the story. It was exciting, like you said. It was very reminiscent of the Matrix Reloaded's the car chase scene, even. But Caleb was kind of inconsequential to this story as well. He's just kind of loopy. It didn't even matter that he horribly missed, and everything still turns out to his favor. So, I again just kind of wonder if that's going to come back around in some way to be like, this is why I thought initially it wasn't linear. It was just kind of these are all the things that could happen as you follow these different paths, and he was just seeing the story progress in a bunch of different ways, although it might not have actually happened. And when we get to the end and he gets a package and doesn't know what's in it, but it looks like a big bag full of guns, it kind of makes me wonder if that was the lead into this storyline, that hey, now he's going to go back, fly somewhere, and that's where they have that bazooka looking thing, and he's going to have that choice. But he doesn't open the bag, he doesn't ask what's in it. It just, maybe I don't want to know.
Right. So the people chasing him down eventually kind of have them stop ish, or they got to the kind of a subway area that they were trying to get to. Not completely sure exactly why, but they kind of stop, and Dolores is shooting her gun. She's looking all badass, and Caleb's genre switches once more to romance, and he kind of looks over her to her with like a glassy eyes, and just very much just kind of
I missed that the on my watch through. I thought he was looking at her like, this is ridiculous that she's so confident and isn't even afraid of getting shot. She's just up and shooting her gun with no fear at all, where he himself was, obviously afraid.
Very much so. So he had a right to be afraid. I don't know if Ash and Giggles hadn't shown up, whether they would have made it out alive, but they do. Ash and Giggles show up and help them finish off Serac's men.
He was just there so he doesn't get fined.
I freaking loved Marshawn Lynch in this episode. He should be in every episode of Westworld. He is freaking brilliant. So they escape in the subway, and Liam tells them basically that his access is read-only unless you're at the node, and you can't be in two places at once.
Except when you can. That's quantum physics, though, right?
And the person who can is Gonells, who, of course, like we found out last episode, is also Dolores. So I'm calling him Gonells throughout here because, differentiate who's who and what's what, etc. So kind of this one will pop back and forth between the two basic plots, this one being freeing of the inside information. So Dolores sends Liam's key to Gonells. Gonells accesses Rehoboam at the node with Bernard in tow. And I had to highlight this one kind of exchange because I feel like it's something that you and I have talked about before and will probably talk about again. And that is Bernard being containing multitudes. The Gonells says, "You've always been of two minds, haven't you, Bernard?" And Bernard, of course, replies, "It isn't that binary." Which, what? He goes on to say, "Living another person's life changes you. Worlds bleed." So, what?
So, yeah, what did you think about that? Because I got something completely different than based on watching the beginning of the episode.
So I had two basic takeaways. For one, the one that we've kind of talked about at length before, and that is the him having Ford in his mind as well, right? But whenever Bernard says it isn't that binary, the possibility that we talked about before was Bernard having Dolores as part of his code as well. So it's not that binary. He's probably like Dolores and Ford and Bernard, and they may or may not all be fighting for dominance essentially as the thing, but they may actually be bleeding over, and they may be kind of becoming that one person, kind of like Dolores and Wyatt have completely merged. Like I think that's what Bernard is kind of either is going through or has gone through, and that living another person's life has changed him significantly, and he's lived multiple people's lives. So that's what I took it to mean, and that's my theory. What is
confused.
yours?
I'm now confused as to who Bernard is and how what his story arc is, because the way he was dressed at this point harkens back to the way Ford dressed when he was a kid, and the way that we were shown Serac and his brother were dressed while they were out in the field. And while they were out in the field and saw the destruction of Paris, then there's a dead cow that really reminded me of episode 1 of this season, where Bernard was trying to care for it, and you kind of get the feeling that they're trying to show us something here, and that perhaps one of those lives, and I'm kind of going out on a limb here and thinking Bernard might have some input from Serac, who has been altered by his brother to be more like him. So we're kind of going like a three degrees of separation here, but it's kind of confusing to me. I still think Arnold, it has to be there somewhere, because I don't think we've seen the last of Sir Anthony Hopkins. But now it's kind of leading me down the path to believe that Serac and Bernard are more connected than we're otherwise led to believe.
I didn't pick up on that, but I really like that, especially like you said, with his brother being the one who ended up programming Serac. Um, that makes complete sense, and it also kind of makes sense that you would have more input into Bernard than we were initially led to believe. I'm really excited to see what happens to Bernard in particular. Like,
I,
I don't think that he's my favorite like actor in this, but oh my gosh, I think he's my favorite character.
yeah, and I think that goes back to where they wanted to obfuscate some things from us. So they didn't want to come out and make that connection as directly. So I think it was kind of hidden, just like at the beginning of the slideshow. Then you say Serac's history is he tells his story to Rehoboam, and they definitely lead you down that path there, because he says, that led us to build you, and then it shows the Rehoboam ball. But if these are points in history where Dolores has downloaded them from the system, I don't think that he's going to be actually talking to the system. I think he's going to be talking to a host, and I think that host might be Bernard.
Oh, I like that a lot. I like that a lot. So after this brief exchange between Connells and Bernard, Connells, he's at the node. He's at the big old metal ball, and he sends Serac's data to Dolores. So she's kind of absorbing it. I don't know if it's this whole time or whatnot, but this is where she acquires the data at the very least. That
And
brings
we're
us
led to believe that that data is the data that we've been seeing that tells Serac's story.
exactly. Now we're kind of jumping back over to Caleb's genre trip. So Caleb's genre changes. I called it clubbing. I didn't know exactly what to call it, but it was like an Iggy Pop song about clubbing while they're escaping on the subway. It was definitely more jubilant than the previous ones, previous genres, which was kind of cool. But I don't know that it was really, like you were saying, consequential to the telling of the story for this one. I think this one was just a kind of general ambiance kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like Train Spotting. It's acknowledging the trippiness and where you go from how you react to the environment around you. Then it leads you to these deeper conversations that they had on the subway, though, and letting that information out.
Absolutely. So they're escaping on that subway, and Caleb's genre changes to suspense. Here is where he tells that rat story that we were talking about earlier. Here's where Caleb tells that rat story to Liam, because Liam's basically saying, false hope, that hope, that's what keeps people going. And Caleb says, gives the allegory of whenever he was serving the rats, like they had some sort of a system where like something would come up to this big like bucket of water, and the rats would somehow fall into that, and they would quickly drown. Like they would just die unless they filled it up too high with water, because then the rats could see that they could maybe get out, and that false hope was, had them struggling to escape despite the fact that they were just dying anyway. So it was kind of an allegory about the danger of false hope, I think.
Or it could have been a misunderstanding, and it shows Caleb's he's not considering the consequences, and that he sees the false hope is bad because you waste a lot of time on things. He's been very apathetic towards most things that have happened through this season. That he doesn't care if people point guns at him until he's on this genre trip. He doesn't really care if people are threatening him, if they're torturing him, if they're going to throw him out the window. He's just ready for it to be over. So maybe that's also meant to show his despair, and that he doesn't really believe any of the hope that is being portrayed, especially now that he knows that some of it is just somebody holding the carrot and begging you to move forward.
That's a really good point. So this is when Dolores has Gonells send everyone their Incite files, and she makes sure to say past, present, and future. So, for example, a lot of what she showed to Caleb was his past. Hey, they've been collecting all of this data from you. The present and the future, yeah, she told him how it predicted that he was going to die, but it didn't really go into more kind of in-depth stuff, or she didn't at the very least, go into anything more in-depth, and definitely didn't go into how he's perceived, the things that other people talk about him, which whenever everyone else was kind of looking at their Incite profiles on their phones or whatnot, that was definitely their present data, and they were not responding well to that.
Right. Which makes you wonder if they purposefully only let out negative information, because you gotta assume that somebody somewhere is like, yes, I win the lottery tomorrow, that's fantastic.
I can't believe it, I'm going to Disney World.
Wow, she loves me, that's incredible.
I'm the chosen one. So as they're kind of leaving the subway, Caleb's kind of looking around and seeing everyone kind of freaking out. He turns to Giggles and is like, what genre is this? And Giggles is like, this is reality. And it's just things are starting to become general pandemonium. Things are starting to break down pretty immediately. And Caleb's like, wait, this isn't a trip? Uh-oh.
Well, so I get that they were trying to show us that things were breaking down, but I felt like that was more while they were still on the subway and people were looking down at their phones and seeing, oh, my daughter has cancer or early onset Alzheimer's or whatever it was, and feeling bad for the future of things. And then when they come out, then there's the couple fighting, but it's still pretty desolate, and there's people sitting around, but there's really not a whole lot happening that makes you think that the world is burning anyway, just that it's an uncomfortable period. So as soon as they tell him that it's reality, that's when the car pulls up and we have Serac's men come and try to shoot him.
We do see two things before they kind of come up and start trying to shoot them. And that's one is people throwing bricks and rocks or whatever through windows, for one.
The rioting, yeah.
And then also the riot of, I don't know if it was jubilant or if it was kind of more despairing or what, whenever Liam says, people are returning to their base instincts. They're either trying to stop a car that's going, or they're almost jet skiing behind it or something like that. It wasn't exactly clear, but it was.
Oh yeah, good point. I thought they were just woo, let's ride the car.
So those things on top of the couple fighting, which was more minor, were the things that made me think it was at the very least, beginnings of general unrest.
Yeah, fair enough.
But pretty quickly, Serac's men do, in fact, pull up in that car. They start shooting. It looks like they were actually shooting at Caleb, which was kind of weird because Dolores steps in front of Caleb and kills Serac's men. I'm assuming it's Serac's men. They don't spell it out, right. But come on, it's Serac's men.
It's likely
right.
It's likely Incite employees or Incite paid. Maybe not Serac specifically, but yeah, you're definitely led to believe that.
They're in his downline.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, we cut back over to Connells and Bernard.
But before we go there, I thought you might want to say a little bit more that
Ooh,
Caleb's
yes.
incredulous at the shots, and she turns and looks at him, and her jacket is zipped down, and he sees all the bullet holes. And uh, I had thought that he knew she was a host previously,
Right.
but the shock in his face tells me that maybe I was wrong. So when she zips it up, obviously doesn't want to talk about it, then he seems confused by this, that he might have actually believed she was real, which I thought was cleared up when they were in the ambulance earlier in the previous episode, and he knew how to fix her. I just kind of thought that he knew that this whole world that he was living in was not real. So that surprised me and confused me as to where we were going, and if
Mm-hmm.
maybe this was a different timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does kind of pop up later. It's very clear that he does not know that she's a host, or if he did know, he has somehow forgotten, be it like programmed out of him or something. But I think you're right. I think he didn't know, because he's like, what, how, what? No, you can't be okay after getting shot. And then later on, he says something as well. But here's definitely where, like those bullets into her abdomen, that seed was planted.
which which is confusing, and might be an inconsistency, or might be something that comes together later, that he wouldn't have been confused that she wasn't in the system when Liam scans her earlier, when he before he tries to escape and goes on his trip. That you would think, if he didn't know, that would have been confusing, like, wait, how are you off the system?
Right. But that does
Anyway,
bring us from there
yes.
into back into freeing the inside information with Collins and Bernard. So Collins tells Bernard that he will have to choose a side, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's like, okay, you're gonna have to choose a side in this war. Duh. Bernard is kind of looking up at the map of everything kind of going on, and yeah, where everyone's getting their data and starting to, as he calls it, being thrown off of their loops. And this was kind of another one of those um, allegories or metaphors or callbacks, really, to season one, that I thought was really interesting. Like, hey, we've introduced nothing but white space now. And that is why they are all completely off their loops, be they programmed externally by Incite, or be they just tracked and kind of encouraged by Incite. Regardless, they're definitely thrown off of those loops now.
Yeah, everybody got their reveries updated, so.
Exactly. Ashley Stubbs, good old Stubbs, comes back up, finds Connells, and subdues him. There's a little bit of punchies and kickies, and I think Bernard actually ends up doing the final subduing, but it wouldn't have happened if Ashley did not instigate that liberation.
Actually, I don't know that it wouldn't have, because he's let go anyway. Like, he knows that his part is done, or and he being Connells knows that his part is done, and his intention was always to let him go so that he could make the decision of which side he needed to choose. But the
True.
damage had to be done first. So I don't think that Stubbs necessarily knew that they had that conversation and were kind of working together there at the end.
Right.
But and I'm not even sure why they needed to have Bernard there, um, unless there is something to my idea that it's Serac and
Mm-hmm.
Bernard are linked, and they needed some extra validation from him to provide the files, but yeah, they let him go, and they encourage him to leave.
Yeah, and whenever they do, like you said, so not only does Connells encourage them to leave, but he does so whenever Serac's cronies arrive, and they're like, "Okay, well, like, are you coming with us? Like, let's go." And that's when Connell says, "My role is finished. You're the one we can't replace." So that I think lends credence to your Bernard as having some code, be it Serac's or Bernard's or Ford's, that they cannot replace because he is the one who kind of needs to be their savior, needs to make the decision, whatever kind of next step that happens. Connell's has already just finished his role, but Bernard's role is yet to come.
And
So,
the reason I think it's more Serac is that I think they could replace Bernard or Arndt or Ford because they would have the pearls for them, or could have the pearls for them. Whereas Serac being more of a virtual world that they're in, maybe different. So they can't replicate that by just copying the pearl. They don't have the technology or understanding of how that works compared to the machinery that they've taken from the parks. So that would make him more irreplaceable.
yeah, that tracks. So, whenever Serac's cronies kind of take Connell's up into this like office, Serac and Connell's talk for a little bit, using the kind of virtual stuff. I was looking at it my second time, and Serac is already quote unquote in the room. So I'm not sure whether Connell's, whenever he did his kind of kamikaze attack, thought that he was taking just Martel, or if he thought that he was killing Martel and Serac. So I'm not sure about that part of it. And I was looking for it whenever I was watching this time because I was like, oh well, he realizes that he's not killing Serac, but I don't know that he does.
This one was really confusing to me because it seemed like Serac would know that that wasn't Martel, or wasn't Connell's, that it was replacement Connell's. So both of them, or neither of them, seemed to have the understanding that I would have expected from that encounter.
Right.
I don't think he was necessarily, because his role that he knew was to send those files about Serac. I don't think his expectation was that he was going to be killing Serac, that Serac was still needed for something at that point. It was more to prevent himself from being taken and possibly provide insight into Dolores.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But it seems kind of odd that in order to execute, not intended but embraced, in order to execute that kind of self-destruct plan, he has to be caught and interact with Serac and let him know that it was him who did the thing? Is it so that Serac doesn't continue looking for moles? Is it like why that had to happen versus just like, okay, well, I'm done. Time to just blow myself up. That that's what didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Was his goal to take Martel with him? Maybe. But it did definitely seem, I'm not going to say very clear, but all of the words that they were using between one another, I don't think that Serac knew that that wasn't really Connell's, which I kind of expected him to, but apparently he did not.
Right, which is really intriguing, unless he was playing a part and that he's actually a part of Dolores's plan, or Serac or Dolores is part of Serac's plan, and he's going down this other path, which kind of lends even more credence to that Bernard is somehow linked to him, and that basically he gets the confirmation from Connell's that his part of the plan that Serac has put together is complete, and now that can end, and the other people in the room are no longer of consequence, so you can kill them as well. And that's why I kind of think some of these, there's a little bit of blurring of the line behind. We've been calling them Serac's people.
Mhm.
I've been trying to hedge a little bit and say Incite employees,
Right.
because I feel like there's a chance for redemption for Serac at some point, um, and that I don't believe that Serac is necessarily evil. That it is more likely his brother that was evil and has implanted
Reprogram.
or otherwise enhanced
That
Serac.
makes sense. So after Connells blows himself up, we see Bernard and Ashley Stubbs leaving. Bernard says that Dolores' plan is starting, and he suspects that he may be part of it.
Hmm.
Which, yeah,
Totally tracks.
totally tracks. From what Connells literally just told him. I'm glad that we got the confirmation that Bernard's like, this is a thing. Because at this
Although
point, I would be worried about him if he didn't.
the confusing part, I think, is to come back to, oh, this is dumb. Of course he's part of Dolores's plan. Is that I took that as, hey, I'm part of Dolores's plan without the realization that it's actually his plan as Serac.
Ah, that'd be fun. So
Yeah.
that kind of finishes up both the genre trip and the freeing of the Incite information. Brings us to our penultimate, and I think that we actually end up finishing up with. No, I think this is our penultimate, one of our last basic plot points, and that is Caleb's identity crisis. So Caleb, here's where he confronts Dolores about the shooters, um, and he says, the shooters. He doesn't. We don't know exactly what he's asking. Like if he's asking who they were, kind of doubtful. What I think is more likely is, of course, hey, you were shot. You're acting like
Yeah.
everything's fine. What gives?
Like, why did I have to treat you in the ambulance if you could just walk away like this?
Right. And she basically says, not now. She just like puts the conversation off to later. And it was kind of coming towards the end of the episode. So it's like, yeah, this is going to be explored more in depth. And this is probably going to be a pretty big revelation to Caleb that, hey, I'm a host and here's what that means and how he's going to grapple with that, especially since he told her earlier in a previous episode, you're the most real thing to happen to me in quite some time or something like that. But he actively used the word the most real thing. So
Right.
she puts that off to later. After doing so, Laura says that we no longer need Liam. Like, we just don't need him anymore. And here, Liam, rather than kind of like, so he's not begging for his life, but he kind of like throws a little bit of a temper tantrum, which can't really blame him after being pretty well told, hey, you're about to die.
Right.
And he tells Caleb that Caleb doesn't even know who Caleb is, and that Caleb is the worst of them. And Caleb starts having these little like flashbacks to things that he doesn't remember. There's this like man that Caleb was torturing, and then at one point Caleb kind of like in a chair with a thing placed over his mouth, kind of like in a straitjacket thing with like a woman over him, and it's glimpses of different things. And I didn't recognize the guy who Caleb was torturing, question mark. He had his head in a bag, stuff like that. If Liam is saying, hey, you're the worst of them, and that's kind of eliciting these flashbacks, and that's kind of what's prompting those. I would imagine that Caleb's doing something nefarious or being used to do something nefarious, be it programming by the woman when he was in the chair to do these things, kind of like what that is, or if maybe the woman in the chair is programming him to forget. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think they purposefully have left that um, hidden, but the face of the person, although he hasn't featured in any of the rest of the episodes thus far is recognizable. So I imagine that we're going to see him again in the last few episodes of the season, and more will become clear as he gets introduced. In fact, I would bet that next week his introduction is the opening of the show.
They've been paying things off pretty quickly this season.
Yeah.
Which on the one hand I appreciate, but on the other hand I'm like, okay, where's all the mystery? And there is quite a bit of mystery, so I shouldn't be too concerned.
Right.
But
like, who is Caleb?
Right. Oh, you were wondering who Caleb was. Let me tell you his whole life story.
Right. Kind of like we got with Serac this week.
And how? So Caleb is having all these flashbacks, and Ash shoots Liam. And Caleb tries to save him because he's having these kinds of flashbacks kind of throughout, and they're definitely being, at the very least, Caleb definitely seems to think that they're being brought upon by Liam saying things, by Liam's prompting. So he's trying to save Liam, if for no other reason than to dive into those memories and see where he actually is from, the things that he doesn't remember. And while Liam is dying, he repeats. He says just repeatedly, "You did it, you did it, you did it." Multiple times as he dies on the beach with Caleb trying to save him. What did he do?
What do you think he did?
I have no clue.
So there's a whole bunch of different ways that this could go, and I'm confused as to where we are. I think that they've kept us in the dark about Caleb's past a bit more than they needed to, and it'll be fun if they actually have been dropping hints along the way. When I first watched, I thought that they were referring back to the conversation when Liam first got scared by Caleb, and he said, "You think I killed your friend?" Then it comes back at the end to say, you did it, meaning you killed Francis. And, But then as I look into it more and we see a couple slides from now where he may be coming to a realization about his own reality, that there's plenty of other things that you did it could mean that would make him the worst of all. One being the person who set off the nuclear bomb in Paris.
Oh.
One being it could be Serac's brother, who started down this path of we need to kill people to make the world shaped the way that it needs to be. So there's a few different ideas that are bouncing around, and I'm not sure if any or all are the same, because obviously can't be Serac's brother and the person that detonated, because they were too young at that point, and it was before the Rehoboam started being the catalyst. But it'd be interesting to see that. I guess it can't really be the Parisian bomber either, because they wouldn't have had the data on it yet.
Yeah, that's true. That would have been a little bit too early.
Unless that was something that came over with Dempsey. So
true. Yeah, the killing his own friend is kind of the one thing that I was kind of thinking, but it wouldn't really have Liam being that upset.
Right.
And Liam was definitely upset.
And that's why I had to go deeper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the bomber makes complete sense. Something to do with maybe the corruption, like you were saying, if Serac was reprogrammed by Serac's brother, maybe he's the one who did that reprogramming. Maybe whatever it is, Liam is responding super negatively to that. And I don't think Liam would be happy if Caleb killed his friend, but I don't think he would be nearly that distressed.
Right, which kind of goes back to the Serac's brother because Serac's brother would have been the one that killed his dad or wanted to kill his dad, so kind of set those events in motion. So if he could see that, then that would be something that would spark that kind of reaction, I think.
Absolutely. So I think that I subscribe to that theory the most right now. That makes the most sense for Liam to be that upset.
Right.
Bringing us to Dolores and Serac's standoff. So after having Liam die on the beach, Dolores and Caleb kind of go to what looks like a kind of airplane hangar. And Dolores and Serac are having an exchange. It kind of seems like the contacts that we've seen Dolores put in, which also she's kind of used to like upload the stuff or download the stuff that Connell sent to her, different stuff like that, is probably how she is seeing Serac here. It's not spelled out, but kind of makes sense. So Serac discovers that Dolores, before we cut to the hangar, we see Serac flying around, and he discovers that Dolores was seeking his files. Not just his files, but his foundational cognitive history. I paused it and had to read what it was there on my second watch through. And the foundational cognitive history is what it called him. Just kind of the more you know. And then, sorry, you were going to say?
I was just going to say, I think that is actually important, because I think that's the part that they weren't able to get through their own simulations. And so the mind map is what they got from Delos. I believe that these are Delos style files that Dolores was seeking, and so that she could possibly rebuild what they have in Bernard. Kind of what I was seeing from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then Dolores and Serac start having their meeting. Serac tells Dolores that it's my system. I alone control it, which already this episode has been proven to be false because they hacked into it like literally like 15-20 minutes before this. So Serac tells Dolores that she thinks you think you know me because you've seen my memories, and Dolores is like, hold on, I don't need to know you. I just need to know how to beat you. And that felt really cool. Like that was a really powerful moment, which is like, I don't need to know you. That was cool.
That conversation, though, I think it's difficult to say that this was linear or if it was a little bit of jumping back and forth, and this might have happened before they released the information to everybody. So it would make more sense that she said it's time for everyone to wake up, give him that information before he said, which is kind of why I was jumping back and forth before the trip or that this scene happened before the genre trip. Is that she had some information, but then she might not have seen all of the memories yet, so I'm not sure how to piece that together. I think that Serac does still control it, and that he has a better understanding of this simulated world that they live in, because I'm still under the assumption that it's not the real world yet, and that he built this system so that he could be the god in it. He said that we needed to build a god. He said it was you, and then he put his own mind into Bernard. So he's kind of making it seem like Dolores has more control in it, but she's really part of his scheme anyway. So she's thinking that she needs to beat him, and he doesn't look scared. He doesn't look confused. He just kind of looks disappointed when she walks through him, like, I'm losing a little bit of control, but it's still going to end up going the same way that I've predicted through my algorithms. So I think it'll be interesting to see how much control Dolores actually has. And then if it's not a simulation at all, then obviously all that's thrown thrown apart, and he's just trying to hold on to the last remaining bits of power that he has.
Yeah. As far as the timeline goes, she at one point says something snide about his brother. And because
Hmm.
of that, I didn't think that it was kind of out of sequence because, like you said, without having that like file upload, without having received the information from Connells at the node, um, she wouldn't have had that kind of leverage, that information to kind of weaponize, which is what she was trying to do.
Right.
That one being just a little bit more kind of snide and petty, but I mean, still a weapon nonetheless.
Right, but some of that could have been happening at the same time. So if
True.
if she had gotten the files and then had that conversation and then released the information, uh, the Dolores timeline doesn't actually touch on their time at the Incite facility, so they could have been running simultaneous tracks, and then just had to recover some of that, and
Mhm.
maybe that'll be proven wrong, and we'll find out what was in that bag that was given to Caleb later. But also, I kind of took because I was already going down the path that possibly Caleb was Serac's brother. That when she made the comment about like your brother, then she was also referring to Caleb. That she knew because when he was asking who does who do they think I am on the beach when Caleb was asking that of Dolores, then she seemed to know, and she obviously would have had some of this um, information as well beforehand, and that's part of the reason why she chose him as her cohort through this and found ways to manipulate him into serving her. So we'll definitely find out, but they're leading me to believe that the brother comment had multiple meanings.
Yeah, it was a little more pointed. It kind of makes me wonder if Francis in this one is not Francis, but is Pete Dempsey, right?
That is interesting. That is very interesting. That's a great point.
And he did kill him, even though he didn't pull the trigger.
Yep.
He made the gun that did. Like he programmed his brother to do it. He programmed Serac to do it.
I like the way you think, sir. It is time everyone woke up.
Yes. Caleb or Dolores says it's time everybody woke up as she walks through the rock. Cut over to
Interesting.
Caleb. Yes.
So interesting with the Serac visions there in that scene and in the scene with Connells. They didn't have to wear their glasses to see him, even though he was obviously projecting himself in. So I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but it seemed they were so particular about making sure everybody had the glasses prior to that. Whenever he would show up, that it seems like there's something else there that we're going to learn.
So I took that one to be a little bit more almost like face value. So whenever they were in the office thing, they were in an Incite facility. They probably have projectors there, right? Just to for like ease of use because he likes to
Mhm.
hologram into places. Um, he was definitely a
So,
hologram.
so do you think the air locker that they were in was an Incite facility?
So I think the locker that they were in, I think Dolores has been wearing those contacts this whole time. And so
Uh,
she essentially had glasses, just, they
got it.
were those contacts that she was using.
That makes sense.
Um, but that's what I think about that one because Caleb was very much like he was there in the background, but he wasn't interacting
Hmm.
whatsoever with Serac. And I think that if he was able to see Serac and whatnot, then he would maybe be a little bit closer, maybe be a little bit present, maybe be reacting to what he's saying a little bit. Whereas if he can't see him, he's just seeing Dolores interact, then he might just kind of be over in the corner doing his own thing, which is what he
He's
was
like,
doing.
whatever. She's talking to herself in the middle of an airplane hangar. Who doesn't do that?
To be fair, I do it at least once a week.
Right.
So Caleb's over in the side, kind of doing his own thing, minding his own business. The package gets delivered to Caleb, and Dolores takes it off his hands. This is one that you mentioned a few times. That looks like it's like this kind of satchel full of guns, but we don't get to see inside of it, so maybe it's not. Maybe it's like host making hardware. Maybe it's something else, but it looks like guns.
Yeah, he does. He asks what it is of the delivery person. They're like, I don't know. I just deliver it, and then he didn't have any more questions. He took it and was just going to load it up. He didn't even ask who it was from. There's like 0 questions, which I have to say, hey, did you send this to me, Dolores, before I put it on the plane that we're going to take? Or, am I supposed to get this? You seem to know everything that's going on. Then she takes it, so obviously it's fine, but it just seems like a few more questions might have been for clarity's sake.
Well, and I kind of understand why he didn't ask the delivery type person, because whenever he's like, I just deliver it, he's like, oh, you're just using like Crime Fiverr to do all this stuff. That means you really don't know where you got it from. You just know you got it and to deliver it here, and then you get the money.
I guess I didn't put 2 and 2 together that came from Rico.
Rico, there we go. I always call it Crime Fiverr.
Crime Fiverr.
But yeah, so that didn't really set off any red flags for me, but set off any red flags for me as far as him not asking the delivery person those questions. However, he very clearly wondered what it was and then didn't open it. Like, he had an opportunity to do so, but he didn't. So, whenever Dolores takes it off his hands, Caleb and Dolores have this kind of exchange where Dolores is like, maybe Liam was right. Maybe people shouldn't know their own fate. Dolores says, people have a right to know. You wanted to know, right? Which Caleb replies, maybe I'm not like other people. And Dolores just shoots him like a knowing look and says, neither am I.
Which, as we were talking before, I thought that indicated that Caleb wasn't who he thought he was and that he was a host or a virtual host. It might not be the case, but it kind of leads you to believe that Dolores has this extra understanding that there's somebody else inside him and he may or may not be real.
And while that wasn't initially what I thought, whenever we had this conversation, I think I am totally bought in on the Caleb is Serac's brother theory, and thus is a host, a virtual host, so, like he has some sort of something,
an altered human.
Yeah, yeah, he could have been programmed, like how they were programming actual human people, depending, or virtual human people, depending on your view of reality in Westworld right now. He was programming those people so he could program his own like mind map into them with the info that they got from Delos that they like bought, so that they could actually give that what was it called,
foundational cognitive history.
Exactly. And that foundational cognitive history could be mapped onto another human, and thus Caleb being perhaps not even a host, but someone else when he doesn't realize it. Be he a host or not, I'm not sure about that part. I think this might kind of be, this episode in particular might be kind of demonstrating that while Delos was doing this with hosts, Incite and Serac and his brother were finding ways to do that real people. And kind of like I was really excited earlier on in the episode about how the white space and the decision point and whatnot being similar for the people and for the hosts. While the host, it was maybe programmed, maybe not. The fact that they already are kind of connecting the two earlier on in this episode, I think is kind of going to pay off in, well, actually, humans can be programmed with other personalities as well, just like Wyatt and Dolores were put together, just like Ford was going into all sorts of other people. I don't necessarily think that Caleb is a host, but I definitely think that Caleb has Serac's brother inside of him. That sounds way dirtier than I meant it to. But I think that calling this whole character arc Caleb's identity crisis is for exactly that reason, because it might not just be Caleb's identity that he's grappling with. It might be more than one.
Which we've seen in multiple characters. We've seen it with Bernard. We've seen it with William. We've seen it with Dolores, Charlotte. The only ones that really seem okay with their spot in the world are Dolores and Gonells.
Stubbs was as well, though in a much different way.
Though I don't think Stubbs we have any indication is multiple people.
True. Very true. No, I completely agree. Being okay with his spot in the world is the only part I meant by that. I definitely don't think Stubbs is more than one identity.
Yeah, I don't think he's okay with his spot in the world either. He wanted to die, right? And so he's trapped and forced to do the bidding for Bernard. But yeah.
So I think whenever he was retiring himself, he was happy with his place in the world because he was able to retire. I think that was kind of his big payoff. You're right. I don't think he's happy with his place in the world anymore. But I think whenever he was going to kill himself, he was. But that's because he didn't approach it with the same kind of like gloom that we would. And he's just like, well, I've served my purpose.
Much like Connells did. Well, my job is done. Now I can retire.
Exactly. So that concluded Season 3, Episode 5 of Westworld. We did a pretty good job of peppering out our theories throughout, so I don't actually have anything additional to add at this juncture. GuyGrumpy, do you have any additional theories?
I do not. I'm excited to see where we go from here, as always. I'm looking forward to going back to the Maeve timeline. There were two other things, I guess, that we didn't really talk about that I think will play a part in later seasons. One, there was also some flashbacks to when they were talking about Serac and his brother in the field, and as they walk through the field, then he held his hand out and you could see it grazing through the grass, which was very reminiscent of the flashbacks that Maeve had in walking through the field to see her daughter. So it leads me to believe that they may also be connected somehow, but they didn't give us nearly enough information to share how that or what that connection would be. I'm looking forward to seeing how that might go. And then right before Connells and Bernard part ways, or as they're walking to the end, where Stubbs shows up, then he says, hey, there's something I want you to see, or something that you need to see first. And it's the place that they're holding all of these anomalies, is this facility. And so I'm guessing that's the facility where Serac's brother was being held, but it could also be, and maybe it's the same place that William is being moved to. So interested to see how that all then ties together and why it was so important to show Bernard that was where he needed to go.
Absolutely.
I'm pretty sure we'll touch on those in the next episode too.
I definitely think so. And if we don't, then probably one of the... Gosh, this was episode 5. We only have 3 more episodes this season.
We only have 3.
What?
There's a lot of identities to figure out still.
There definitely are. And even though they're all Dolores, I think wholeheartedly that they are all also other people, which we have, of course, discussed at length. Thank y'all very much for joining us for this week in Electric Grumpy World. I, of course, have been Electric Sheep City. You can find me at twitch.tv/ElectricSheepCity or at Twitter at eSheepCity. You can, of course, find my good friend GuyGrumpy on the internet at twitch.tv/GuyGrumpy or on Twitter at GuyGrumpy. Our intro and outro music have been by Shadeswiper, who can be found on Twitter at Shadeswiper. Our logo and design and whatnot has been done by Riraro, who can be found on Twitter at Riraro. I said it like that because it's Riiraaroo. He doubled him for his Twitter. Thank y'all very much for joining us here this evening. You stay electric, and you stay grumpy.
Stay grumpy.
World.